The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2019 World Affairs Forum, Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World. In this lecture, Ownership, Competition, and Quality Journalism. Where are we? How did we get here? What can we do? Dr. Stephen Lacy, Michigan State University Professor Emeritus in Journalism and Mass Communication, analyzes external forces impacting journalism and its audience now and into the future.
Thank you. I want to thank the University of Alaska Southeast and JWAC for inviting me. It's been a wonderful weekend. I have learned...
I did it again.
That's okay. I've learned a tremendous amount from being here, so thank you very much. The worst nightmare of a stand-up comedian is to have to go on after another comedian just killed the audience with laughter. There is an academic equivalent of that, and that is to be the last presenter at a forum where all the other speakers are intelligent and articulate. And I find myself in that position today, and I raise it simply because I want to warn you there will be redundancy. But that's not a bad thing. It suggests that we're beginning to coalesce and find consensus about what the problems are in this area. So again, I will try and put a little bit of different angle on it, but there is going to be an overlap as to what we've talked about so far. Well, I would change the title. That's the problem with presentations. They want your title. Well, here it is, and then a month later, you've totally changed your mind about it. But so what I'll call this is the state of U.S. journalism. Where are we? How did we get here? And what can we do? So first thing is there was a nice survey done of roughly 5,000 journalists in 2015 about what are the challenges facing journalism today. And these are the responses. The first column are managers and the other column are staff, and they're fairly consistent. And this won't surprise you. Things haven't changed a lot in 4 years. So this is going to be a foundation of what I'm going to do, but I'm going to flip things and I'm going to start talking about the idea of quality journalism. Because quality journalism is a foundation for the success of any journalistic organization you do. We have done dozens of studies, and what we've found is that quality journalism increases circulation. And circulation increases lead to more income, more revenue, more profit, etc. The fact that people ever doubted that sort of makes me scratch my head. Sure, we all go and buy automobiles that'll fall apart. Of course, who cares about the quality? Everybody cares about the quality they invest their time and money in. So I want to start with a couple of things. First of all, journalism has two forms. This is my little typology. It's news and opinion. Too many people confuse the two. They have different processes, they have different standards. And when you look at an opinion piece and decide that news is biased, well, you're just wrong. So this is a useful thing to remember. Next point is that quality applies to individual items. That's a great story. But usually it applies to bundles. Now, everybody initially talked about the internet as unbundling our bundles, because journalism's always been in bundles. Newspapers have sections. Those are little bundles, and you can pass them out around the kitchen table to members of the family or whatever. TV news, they are bundles of stories, weather, sports, news, etc., etc. So the idea of quality journalism really applies more when it comes down to what we want to spend our time with, to the bundle. And this, of course, is how journalism organizations draw a lot of people in. They put a lot of things in the bundle that can be shared, and the traditional way allows for serendipity. The stumbling over things that you would not have seen because you didn't know they existed, and you wouldn't have gone out and looked for them. Serendipity is a wonderful thing. We learn a lot through that. So bundles are important when it comes to journalism and quality. So at a very simple level, I think of journalism quality as information that serves the needs and wants of the individuals and community. They have value because they do that. Now, there's a lot of discussion on what's the difference between needs and wants. You know what you need now. You don't know what you'll need in 4 days or 5 days. Something may come up. So part of the journalist's job was to anticipate the needs of the community so that when it became a want, it was there. So as we lose journalists, we lose that ability to anticipate needs And sometimes we're left only with wants, and we don't have what we need when it happens. Now, there is a huge variability in our needs and wants. And this leads to the idea that journalism quality is subjective, which on the face is sort of ridiculous. If it were totally subjective, it would be random. We each would want our own little thing, and it would be so different there would be no way that you could put together bundles that would attract a large number of people. So no, it's not totally subjective. And it's never been objective. That's a myth that people probably promoted so they could sell newspapers. I prefer to think of it as intersubjective, just as science is. So there's no one universally agreed upon set of quality standards, but there can be agreements within subgroups about quality standards. And we've investigated that with research. So to talk about quality, I think you should specify a perspective. So here's three very often seen perspectives. The audience. Now, there are a group of people who think that Fox News is quality news and good for them. That's their opinion. There are people who think New York Times or the Empire or any number of bundles of information are quality. So even within audience, you sort of have to specify, well, what group of the audience are you talking about when you want to discuss quality? But there's also the professional journalist approach. And there's a lot of research. I'll get back to this just in a second. And of course, journalism scholars, and we all know that that's the right set of standards. So there can be shared standards, but there's also variance. The question is, how much variance is there? And so there's been research that indicates that journalists don't always agree. Journalists who work at metro daily newspapers don't always agree with people that work at smaller community dailies or weeklies. So there's variance there. People who depend on text or audio, video, oftentimes have different standards for what quality is, because they're different media. And so they have different processes and different functions. There's a great deal of variance based on political awareness and interest in knowledge. And we'll come back to some of this in just a second. However, the research suggests that if you think about quality as overlapping as Venn diagrams, right? There is a great deal of overlap, particularly among professionals and people who are politically aware. They're looking for certain types of quality, but these are things that continually sort of pop up when it comes to quality. Strong local coverage, that's this country, this is US. If you go to Europe, you'll find different things. They don't have the distribution of power amongst the layers of political entities like we do. And the journalism system will always reflect the political entities because at its very core, journalism is about government. Other things, but government is an important part. So strong local coverage should be accurate. It should have good writing. And then if you ask about news organizations, they should have integrity. They should be impartial. They should be independent. So these are the types of descriptors. Now, the problem you bump into is that people will have different definitions of these descriptors. So what's good writing? Somebody tell me what makes good writing. Anybody? Clarity. Okay? Engaging. Now, the reality of American journalism is it's not written at the 6th or 7th or 8th grade level. It's written at freshman college level. And that's because 92% of all of the people who work in journalism have college degrees. I had a professor who did a study looking at the readability, how difficult it is to read newspapers and novels over 100 years, from 1880 to 1980. And what they found is it was like this perfect V. Novels became easier to read, journalism became harder to read. And so, given the literacy in this country, I always think there's about a third of the people who are not comfortable or simply cannot understand the level of writing in newspapers. So you've automatically eliminated a third of your potential audience because of the nature of how you're preparing the product, the content itself. So good writing can have variation, but clarity is something. But it's clarity for who? So who are you writing for? But the whole point of all of this is that, yes, there are subjective elements of quality, but there are also areas of agreement. And so since we do have a lot of local coverage, part of what journalists have to do is to figure out what it is that's clear to their audience. So anyway, that's just a quick look at the idea of quality. Producing quality journalism, almost any way you define it, requires newsrooms with a sufficient number of journalists with adequate training and knowledge. And as we get to in a second, we'll find out that's a lot of the problems with conditions today. So quickly, that first URL, thank you, Carl, it will take you to about a 60-page review of literature on quality journalism that I wrote with Tom Rosenstiel about 4 years ago. And so if you're interested in knowing more about quality journalism, go download the PDF. These other three things are places you can find a lot of data about quality journalism. Pew Research, American Press Institute are doing great work now when it comes to data and all of that. Journalism.org is the journalism part of Pew Research.org. It used to be a separate website called Project for Excellence in Journalism that Tom Rosenstiel ran before he went to the American Press Institute. So anyway, good places to go for data. Most of the data I talk about will be from those two sources today. So, all right, let's get back to the flood of opinion and false information. As we know, absolutely true. 95% true, 99% true. That's what we've heard a lot about today. Opinion journalism is not necessarily bad unless it contains lies that aim to manipulate you against your own best interests, and that should be disinformation. I found it. Thank you. But it's absolutely true. It's part of the problem we have. Just like two forms of journalism, we need better typologies when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, etc. But it's always been around. So what's different today? Well, digital technology allows anyone to generate pseudo-news. Anyone can make something look like it's journalism. Doesn't even take that much work. You just go online, as someone pointed out, learn how to write breaking news, generate it. And I say that I don't have a journalist. I never took a writing course before I wrote for newspapers, and that was a problem because when I first had my first job at a daily, there were many days I thought I was going to get fired at the end of the day, because I didn't know what I really knew. I learned on the job. That's part of it. Pseudo-news can be delivered through platforms that many trust, we'll come back to this, and are reinforced by their friends and family. So I read it, and then Aunt Bessie said it, and so yeah, I'm getting triangulation here. This has to be real. It takes advantage of basic human psychological processing. And this gets into my early training was as an economist, and there's this assumption of rationality. It's never been true. So here are some of the information of processing things that allow disinformation to manipulate us. The idea of selectivity, and if you've taken a psych course, you've heard of this. So we have selective exposure, attention, perception, and retention. And so you all are the portion of Juneau that had the good taste to come here today. Everybody else has not exposed themselves to this. So if you say, what were you doing on Saturday? Well, most people are not going to say this, but you will. But even though you're here, you will attend to what's said at different levels. I'm just thankful we don't have a big picture window so people could be staring at the mountains. Then no one would be attending. But we do carry these little attention grabbers. And anyone who has taught at a university understands the problem with these. And so we don't attend to everything. And then we perceive it all differently because we all have different experiences that allow us to interpret. And finally, retention. And when you get to be 70 like me, that becomes a larger and larger issue. So even if you paid attention, it doesn't mean you're going to remember it tomorrow. So these are selective processes that mean that everyone in this room today will leave here with a little bit different perception, memory of what went on. And that's not a good or bad thing, it simply is a thing. There's also the idea of cognitive miserliness. And that is, we want to be efficient with how we use our cognitive brain power. So we will search for things maybe, but when we find something and that seems right, we don't go any further. So we're not rational consumers like economists always assume. We do not consider all of the alternatives, the cost and benefits, and then make a decision for most of our decisions. We do some, right? People do that. We can learn that. So we tend to fall back on heuristic. Little rules for making decisions that are not based on this processing, this rational processing. Tversky and Kahneman were two economists, behavioral economists, who studied this and came up with the idea of all of these heuristics. Availability bias, confirmation bias, there's a whole list of them. There is a book called The Undoing Project, which it's a really nice book. The guy who did Moneyball about the Oakland A's, Black, I believe, Lewis Black, I think it's Michael Lewis. Okay, Michael Lewis. And it's all about how these two scholars basically upset the apple cart for economists to demonstrate that we are not maximizing processors. As a matter of fact, Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for his work a couple years ago. Another guy died early. Sorry, Nobel doesn't, you don't give prizes to dead people. Availability bias, you all know what that is? So we have a tendency to pay attention to what's there. So if you're going on Facebook to check up with what's going on with your cousin or your aunt or your mother or your daughters or whatever, you bump into stuff. It's available. And you tend to pay attention to it because it's available. Remember, we're misers. So we're going to read it because it's there. We have questions, it's there. Confirmation bias is simply the tendency we have to seek out information that confirms our biases to begin with. And we've actually known about this. There was a study done in 1940 and written up as the People's Choice. And they followed 600 people in Sandusky, Ohio for 6 months before the election. And what they found is the biggest use of information was reinforcement. It wasn't changing minds. It was confirming what you already believed. Cognitive dissonance. Heard about this yesterday, smoking and cognitive dissonance. I have lived through two of the great cognitive dissonance processes in the history of the world. One is smoking. I smoked for 12 years, and I knew the science. I was a smart person. And we would all tell each other, they're going to find a cure for cancer, or they don't really know for sure yet. It's only 80% sure that it's caused. But all that, of course, as we point out, had to do with disinformation from the tobacco industries. And now, of course, climate change, cognitive dissonance. It's becoming harder and harder to have that conflict as the environment actually changes, as the climate changes. So all of those people in the Midwest now who are dealing with the floods, my wife lived through Hurricane Harvey and all the stronger hurricanes. Now, hurricanes that are 5s, not 2s and 3s, but 5s are hitting the country on a regular basis, and it has to do with what's happening to the oceans. So that cognitive dissonance, we're now at, hopefully are at a stage we reach with smoking where we're beginning to realize, no, the information's right, our beliefs and attitudes are wrong. But that's a natural tendency. We tend to do that. There's something called schema, which is the plural, schemata is the singular, and that simply means that we all have this cognitive structure in our heads that allow us to gain new knowledge. And it comes from our education and our experiences, and it takes in new information and it sort of batters it around. And so it can be very simple or it can be very complex. Depending upon and we also have schema for a whole lot of different things. It's not like we have one giant thing. So if I go to see a hockey game, no, not hockey because I don't know anything about hockey, basketball game with my wife, she's excited about who wins and who loses. And while I care about that, you know, basketball was a sport I loved, and so I know how it's played, and I ask what, not just what, but why and how. So most people who have simple schema are interested in what, when, where. People with complex schema want to know how and why. And so we process differently. Now, all of this is natural. This is not a good or bad thing. It is a thing. But we can unlearn some of these biases. The fact that it is nature doesn't mean that we can't change. There's a movie called African Queen, and the Katharine Hepburn character tells the Humphrey Bogart character, nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we were put on the earth to rise above. And so we don't have to maintain these natural tendencies. We can unlearn them. We can work against them. The whole idea of being a scientist, and I think being a journalist, is not doing away with biases because it's built in, it's controlling the biases. So anyway, this is why it works, because of all of these and other sorts of psychological processes that we're engaged in. Okay, so now let's move on to the broken economics. It's not broken everywhere, right? Depends. Depends on the market level, depends on the medium, et cetera. So I'm going to go through real quickly some data here. National is doing fine. Other areas are suffering. Local print has been hit hardest so far, but local TV is beginning to be hit hard as well. So we'll go through quickly some of the data here. Cable news has seen slight audience declines, but their revenues actually increased. It's national television, it's cable news, and the staffing is stable. Network news shows saw a decline. Now they've sort of stabilized. There's been a slight increase in ad revenues. Radio. AM/FM audience shares are pretty stable. Matter of fact, most of us hear at least some radio. Probably 90% of us experience radio at least once every 2 weeks or so, sometimes more, depends on how much time you have to spend in your car. Online weekly radio increased more than 400% in a decade. Podcasts, 400% in 12 years. The NPR podcasts now have 4 million unique listeners a week. Radio is a great way of getting news. Local TV news audience have slipped about a third. Airwave revenue declined, but digital is starting to tick up now. It's not as lucrative, but it's starting to increase. The trends, these same sort of trends exist for African American, Hispanic news media, a whole range of niche media. It's not just the mainstream that are experiencing these sorts of things. Right now, 45% of all advertising dollars are digital. 2/3 are mobile. That's only going to grow. And it's not like anybody has a choice about this. If you want to be a journalist, you've got to go to where things are happening. Again, that's from Pew Research. All right, newspapers. Advertising revenue dropped from $48 billion 18 years ago to $16 billion. Huge. Ryan, I think yesterday talked about classified, Craigslist. That was accounting for 30 to 40% of the advertising revenue at small newspapers. Maybe we'll talk about what people should have done later. Circulation revenue grew, but a very little. And most of that is getting into the idea of digital subscription. Daily circulation dropped from 55.7 million to 40 million. Daily newsroom employees dropped from 71,000 to 39,000. Huge drop. Part of that was a decline in numbers of dailies, but it wasn't just that. It was also the fact that the dailies that survived have lost journalists. Now, interestingly, once-a-week newspapers grew. Now, that includes free weeklies, but also paid weeklies, et cetera. And that's an interesting area I've done a little research with. Again, that's the editor and publisher and some others. So, if you combine weekly and daily circulation and you look at the print output per week, the decline's not as much as if you only look at dailies. Top 50 circulation newspapers average about 3 million unique visitors a week. Part of the problem is we don't know how to measure the new access system. Millions of stories are viewed every day, newspaper stories, through aggregators, Google News, Facebook, but they're never counted. So we really don't have a good measure of what's happened to the audience. If you include all news media, there are as many people accessing news today as there have ever been. Quickly, the digital thing, and the reality is simply this. It's the home of both legacy and born-on-the-web news outlets. That is not the future, that is the now. Really what's happened with the weekly thing, we did a study about newspaper closures in the 80s and 90s, and what we found is that most of the dailies that supposedly closed did not disappear. About a third became weeklies, about a third merged with another newspaper in the county or in the county next door. and then another third became zoned editions of other dailies. So the news didn't go away for everyone, it just transformed. Now the reality though is it did not happen as much. There wasn't as much staff, there weren't as many stories. Now I'm going to show you some quick data things that I think are interesting. People who like to watch the news, people who want to read the news, and people who want to listen to it. We need to stop talking about newspapers and television stations and radio stations and start talking about video, text, and audio. Because now, every news organization can compete in that digital area with all three of those things. And the really good news organizations that will survive will tell you we're going to provide journalism that people want and need in the way that they want to get it. So that is not the future, that is the now. But we continue to talk about newspapers and television. I just did that. So we've got to rethink the way that we frame journalism. Now, having said that, the reality is that we all get news in many types of platforms and media every day. So they simply ask, please tell me if you use each device or technology to get news in the last week. And that adds up way to more than 100%. So we use multiple platforms to get our news. That, again, is the reality. So we have to start thinking of journalism in a little bit different way than we have over the years. I really found this interesting. So they asked people if they used the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal to get information about the election. The people who used it most from these legacy sources were younger people. Older people used the local newspaper. Now that tells you a lot about what's happening. So if I'm running the empire, I want to know how to get those people who are using text over here to my newspaper as well as the New York Times or whatever. So this idea that young people don't read, don't care about newspapers, they're not reading it in print, they're reading it online. But it's coming from the New York Times, I think someone pointed out yesterday, now has more digital subscribers than real subscribers. They have 4 million viewers, readers, whatever. So they sell 4 million subscriptions a day. That's more than they ever sold when they were just a newspaper. Matter of fact, it's probably twice what they sell. Social media. So these are people who are reporting, I get news on social media. But this is what's really interesting. 57% say it's largely inaccurate. 42% say it's largely accurate. Whether it is, of course, depends on what you're reading. We don't get into that. But it's interesting that the fact that you get it doesn't automatically mean that you believe it. And finally, the ability to distinguish. So they ran an experiment with people. They gave them 5 news stories and 5 opinion stories and asked them, was it news or opinion? Most people, only 26% were able to identify all 5 factual statements as factual. 35% identified all opinion statements as opinion. And you look over here, and almost 50% got 3 or fewer of the factual statements correctly identified. In other words, it's hard for them to tell the difference between news and opinion. Not everybody, but a lot. So it gets back to the idea of that's why you can fool people. So what do the data show? Quickly summary, journalism problems are more about the revenue than the audience. It's interesting, they've done surveys of journalists and asked them, well, how's the quality of journalism? Well, it's gone down slightly, most of them say. And then they say, how's your journalism? Oh, it's gone up. Third person effect, right? It's affecting you worse than it is me. I think the reality is it's not about how good or bad the journalism. Journalists are still doing their jobs. It's just that there aren't enough to do the job well for the bundle. So the bundle's not as good as it used to be. And that's how we view journalism. It's the bundle. National journalism system, they're fine. They're making money, et cetera. The problem is more at the local level and more with print. News deserts. We did a study in 2000, 150 cities all over the country about how well city government was covered in every medium. And what we found is this: if your town does not have then a newspaper Its city government was not covered on a regular basis, period. Dailies were the best, weeklies were okay. Citizen journalism sites were sort of like weeklies, but most towns don't have them. Local NPR stations did a really good job, but only 25% of these cities had a local NPR station. So there are news deserts when it comes to local government. It's part of what it is. Weeklies are replacing dailies. So in Ann Arbor, they had a daily newspaper. It became a twice weekly, but every day things changed online. So that's a transitional model that's increasingly happened. So if you want to read the print, you can still get it, just not as often as you used to, but if you want to get breaking daily news, you go online because it's there as best as they can do. People generally depend on video more than text. That has implications. Won't spend a lot of time on. And as that data point, the use of legacy text is not just the elderly. It's anybody who is interested in finding things out. People use multiple platforms. Many citizens can't differentiate between reporting and opinion. There is a love-hate relationship with social media news. It appears many can't differentiate rational argument from propaganda and misinformation. How did we get here? Well, here's the interesting thing. In 1992, about a dozen of scholars of media economics did a special edition in Newspaper Research Journal about the threats to local newspapers. It wasn't the internet, it was cable. Cable started selling local advertising, and it hit newspapers strong. And then they got hit by digital. So they're really reeling from not just digital, internet, web, mobile. Cable did it first. So there are a lot of things that hit them, but these are advertising alternatives that are being used. Loss of circulation audience. Now the reality is a lot of that was because of disinvestment in the newsroom. If you cut the staff, the journalism isn't as good and people will drop your newspaper. And I don't know how many times I told editors that, and they had to get hit up the side of the head before they began to realize that's what was going on. And now they don't have enough advertising revenue to replace those staff that they cut. Now, it happened because of the trend of public ownership. Public ownership simply means that anyone in this room can buy stock in a news organization. When you have public ownership, the goals become high, consistent profits. The only way you can guarantee high, consistent profits if you're a manager is by controlling cost. Revenue is hard to predict, especially in a digital world. So the only control you have is cut, cut, cut. And that's what they did to meet the quarterly demands of the stock investors. And over time, there's a huge disinvestment. Other thing is there was decline in daily competition. Competition forces you to meet the competition by providing better journalism. And so what you find is when there are competitive papers, the staffs are bigger. There's a bigger news hole. There are more wire services. In other words, a better journalistic quality bundle. Competition disappeared, public ownership came in, and a lot of the loss in circulation was due to those things. We did a study of a group that stopped being a newspaper group, Thomson. Studied it over a decade. The reason we picked Thomson is because the CEO came out and said in 1993, we produce crappy newspapers. That's a direct quote from the guy who ran the business. And so we thought, well, why don't we look at this? And so we took Thomson and we did a random selection of other newspapers the same size from the same states and compared what happened to the circulation. Thomson lost over a decade something like 20-something% more readers. The other newspapers basically didn't lose anybody. Thomson was losing them left and right. They were making 35% profit margins. So what do you think is going to happen? So these two things happened. Then, of course, as we know, the alternative for accessing news, aggregators, social media, lack of innovation. There used to be a newspaper group called Knight Ridder, which no longer exists. Knight Ridder was experimenting with the concept of the tablet. As a matter of fact, they were doing this in Denver. It turned out that Apple was on the same floor, had offices on the same floor that they had. The problem is this was before they had the technology to produce a tablet. They were also, in Miami, they had something called Viewtron, which was an early form of the web. electronic distribution of news. But the problem is this: the Knight family liked the idea of investing in innovation. The Ritter family did not. The Ritter family took over, it all disappeared. So the news industry was terrible at innovation. I have a friend, historian at Michigan State, who did a book called Sound Bites, and it's what happened to newspapers when radio came along. And what the smart newspapers did is they invested in radio. So by the middle of the 1940s, a third of all the radio stations in the country were owned by newspapers. And then the FCC said, can't do that, cross ownership rules, and they had to sell them. So what happened is the smart money was, let's use the new technology. We can get, as they like to say, synergies. And so we'll run a newspaper with a radio station. Well, regulation said no, and that disappeared. So that did not happen with the internet. When Craigslist came around, newspapers should have said, okay, free classifieds. Just come to our site to get it. And they would have kept people there. But they didn't do that because, they had to make the profits, et cetera, et cetera. Managers at newspapers, it's really interesting, have never been very good at adjusting. I say never, not in the 50s forward. So a lot of it was simply bad management, failure to plan, failure to understand what was happening in the world because they had quasi-monopolies and were rolling in the money. Gannett used to bring in 25% profit margins. Quarter out of every dollar went to the ownership. Last year they barely broke even, just a little bit above zero. Managers lost sight of the central mission. And this is what happens when the money goal becomes the most important thing. You forget that you should be a central institution in your community. And there are lots of ways to do that, or beyond conversation today. But once you give up with being important to your community, and they become people you make money off of, then they tend to not think of you as being special anymore. You're no longer the center of my universe. You're like a car dealership. So you're not special anymore. Newspapers, once upon a time, when they were good in communities, were special. So those are all things that happen. But what can we do? And again, several people talked about the demand and the supply side, so we'll break it down that way. On the demand side, audiences have to reduce confirmation bias and control emotional reaction. We talked about this earlier, thank you. Video is emotional. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a role, but it should be a role that's balanced by the rational cognitive processing. You can't evaluate and make decisions well unless you've got both of those things, I think. But what happens is we just tend to react to the emotional because it's designed to get that reaction from us. That's the best way to get our attention. Except that audiences must pay more for journalism. Brian again mentioned this new State of the Media thing that came out Pew last week. 71% of the people that were interviewed think that local news organizations are doing fine financially. There's a huge disconnect there. Doesn't surprise me. Newspapers have never done a very good job explaining themselves. Only 14% say that they actually have subscriptions now. So the audience has got to understand that it's going to cost them more money if they want quality journalism from whatever source. Local advertisers need to learn the limits of digital advertising. 50% of the ads that appear online are never seen by human eyes. There was an article I read about a very large corporation who was buying 47,000 web impressions per day. And they thought, well, they cut back to 5,000 a day, and there was no change in their sales. The reality is that we don't know a lot about we don't even know a lot about how television advertising works, because the people who teach advertising in our schools, and I know I spent a year as acting chair of the advertising department, they study how to do it well. They don't study what's actually happening. There's a lot of wasted advertising, huge wasted advertising through any medium. Online, digital, there's no idea what's going on out there. Journalism, I did a consulting thing once at a weekly newspaper in Michigan, and I went and talked to the dealership for cars. And I said, well, tell me about how you buy ads. Yeah, well, John comes up from the newspaper, tells me how much I ought to buy, and that's what I do. I write a check. And it's like, how can you run a business this way? But that's how it happens in so many cases. So advertisers have to become more educated, learn to differentiate news from opinion, misinformation, etc. Understand that video and text are processed differently, and each has its advantages and disadvantages. Community institutions must join to teach media literacy. Thank you, Eric, and everybody else, right? And civics. Foundations need to invest in the demand side. The Knight Foundation, which is left over from Knight Ridder, continues to try and invest in how to make journalism better. You need to invest in how to make consumers better as well. It's a two-sided thing. But, you know, that's why I retired. They stopped listening to me. Okay, supply side, local journalism. Owners and managers have to take a longer-term perspective. It's not every quarter has to reach this profit goal. Sometimes, and most anybody who runs a local business who is not a large corporate will tell you this. Some months are thinner than others. That's part of our plan. That's part of our understanding because we want to be here for a long time. Adequate newsroom investment, we've already talked about. We need better research to understand the needs and wants of people in the community. Our journalism school worked with a group of Mexican newspapers called Grupo Reforma. It's a really interesting story, and I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but they have 4 daily newspapers, 5 sections each, so there are 20 sections in their newspapers. Every single section has a reader committee. The editor meets with that committee of 13 people every week, and they talk about what the newspaper did and what it didn't do. They get ideas from these reader committees. And so they basically have 240 people telling them about how good a job they're doing. And I talked to one of the editors, and he said it's a pain in the ass. They go in there, and sometimes they really hammer us. We go in there, and sometimes they have great ideas. He said, but I couldn't produce a good newspaper without them. So there are lots of ways that American journalists have never even begun. As a matter of fact, that person delivered the keynote address at a AEJMC conference once. And people just sort of shaking their head. Well, no, we can't let them decide what's news. Well, them have left the building, so something went wrong there. If you don't trust your readers, your community, you shouldn't be in the business. Because your business is to serve that community. And if you don't understand it, you can't serve it. So anyway, so better research. How do we know what people want and need? How can we find that out on a regular, ongoing basis? There was a famous study done by Knight Ridder about their readership in the early 90s, and they called it Love Us and Leave Us. Because what they found is people kept buying the newspaper and not reading it. They bought it because they thought it was part of their civic duty, and it would pile up in the corner because they didn't have enough time to read it. Now, part of the problem with that, sir, I think there was a lot of validity to that, but it was supposed to be how do you get more readers, and they conducted it in Boca Raton, Florida. Now, Boca Raton is not the average city in this country, number one. Number two, they did it there because it was close to headquarters in Miami. It is like, that's not how and why you do research. So even when newspapers, news organizations have done research, they're not always doing it in a way that will actually give them the information they need. I think community members should start citizen journalism sites. I don't have time to talk with you about this. I've done research in the area of citizen journalism. And what we found is that citizen journalism sites are not replacements for legacy media, but they can be important supplements to the journalism in the community. As a matter of fact, we did a survey of City Hall reporters, and most of them said, yeah, we've got journalism websites, and of course they don't cover it like I do, but they do add to the discussion. I have to read them because occasionally they come up with something that I didn't know, or I wasn't going to do a story about. So if you all are inclined, this guy named Lee Becker, who is a retired journalism professor at University of Georgia, it's fairly well known in the field of researchers. His hobby now is a county government blog website, and he does a great job. He puts up regression analysis to analyze what's going on in the community, and he's become a very important part of the discussion about county government. And he does it as his hobby, his interests, etc. So we need more people who will do that. Figure out how to better use technology for journalists. Journalists have still not figured out interactivity as a way of making their news organizations better. Now, it becomes a place where people want to gripe or whatever, but they're not using it, they're not exploring it, they're not experimenting with how we can use one of the great tools of digital communication, the interactivity. So we've got to figure that out better. Again, as getting back to ads, they need to better understand digital metrics to sell local ads, which means education. They have to educate the advertisers. Oh, okay, so we talked a little bit about this, the EU directive about royalties this week. Basically, if you're in Europe and you're Facebook or Google or anybody else, you can no longer say, sorry, I didn't put it up there, it's not my job. If there is copyright material on Google or Facebook, they have to pay royalties now in Europe. And it's like, duh. If you're a musician and you're on Spotify, you get royalties. It may not be much, but if you get a lot of listens, you get royalties. You have to pay journalists. Otherwise, you don't have professional journalists. So there's got to be work with, my hope is that what's going on in Europe will sort of push folks in this country to start thinking about, yeah, we aren't really newsrooms. We use newsrooms, so we need to make sure that they're around. Again, get back to the center of the community. Make yourself an essential institution in any numbers of ways. Oftentimes, it doesn't mean just publishing. It means participating in civic activities, making sure that everybody, it happens sometimes. I had a friend who ran some weekly newspapers out in Middle Texas. And it turns out the county commission got together and passed a tax increase behind closed doors. It was a closed meeting, which it was illegal. And so he went to them and he said, undo that or you're going to read about it in the newspaper next week because it's illegal. It got undone. Famous story in Washington, the integration of swimming pools happened because Philip Graham, who ran the Washington Post, went and said, if you don't fix this, you're going to read about it every day in the Washington Post. And so they integrated the swimming pools in Washington. So there are a lot of things that institutions, news institutions can do that will influence your community that are beyond just the publishing. Okay. Problem is, there is no one size fits all. What works in Juneau may not work in Lansing. Each community news outlet is different and will require experimentation and commitment, an effort to find out what works locally. The American Press Institute now is actually working in that area. So they post ideas, tools, things that you might use in your community. They don't guarantee they will work, but it is an opportunity to get some ideas that could work if you go out and you try to apply them. So there's help. But you have simply got to figure out what works locally because there is no one thing. A country's journalism system reflects what the citizens are willing to support. In effect, we get the journalism we deserve or we want, and that's the truth. Now, there was a cartoon that used to come out called Pogo by Walt Kelly. There was a line from Pogo, we have met the enemy and he is us. And to a great degree, that's explains what's going on in the press system today. Is we, the readers, and this is not new, you've heard this before, are not doing their part of the job. But then at the same time, managers at newspapers didn't do their job when they should have either. So it's a systemic problem that cuts across demand and supply side. So thank you very much. Appreciate your attention. And got time for a couple of questions.
This is how I run naturally.
Thanks for that. That was a really nice overview and kind of historical, kind of retrospective of where we are. Just a couple questions in different areas. Number one, you mentioned one of the things we should do is somehow train or educate the audience to be better consumers of news. So appreciate your thoughts on that. Number two, why, particularly newspapers, are so reluctant to kind of perform a traditional civic function, to be that special organization. So I think back about the kind of decline of the LA Times, and it's still there, but it's a shadow of what it used to be. And there was a story in the early 2000s that on revenue of $1 billion, they made 200 million profit, 20% profit, which is in line with what you were saying. And the demand from the publisher to the editor was to fire 100 reporters.
Yeah.
I mean, what are you doing at that point?
It had become a public corporation at that point. And interesting, and being a private company doesn't guarantee you're going to have quality journalism. There have been, and an example is the Oklahoma Daily, I think, Oklahoma City's daily newspaper, Gaylord family. They were just as bad as public back in the day. But it gives you the choice. And the story about the LA Times before, when Nixon was coming up, the LA Times was a real partisan Republican paper. The Democratic Party could not announce a gathering without buying an ad. So if you wanted to announce, the Democrats are getting together, you had to buy an ad in the LA Times. Otis Chandler, who's the scion of the family, is the one who carried it to where it became and made it into a modern newspaper. But that was their choice. So you don't get a choice with public ownership unless, I'm getting a little bit deep here, unless you're the New York Times and you have two-tiered stock. So you can buy stock in the New York Times, but you can't buy voting stock. So you don't get to make policy with that stock ownership. And so it's controlled inside. Control of Gannett has, well, it was the last time I studied it, about 2% of the stock was held inside the company by the managers or the board or the family that helped start it. The other 98% is out there in the stock market. And when that happens, you have to react to the analysts, because every quarter they say, what do you expect you're going to earn next quarter? And it's announced. And if you don't meet that, your stock prices go down. And if your stock prices go down and you're on the board, all those people who own stock are going to say, you've got to change this or you're not going to be on the board anymore. And the board goes to the managers and say, you've got to change this or you're not going to be managers again. So a lot of what happened is simply explainable by the change in ownership. Yeah. Is that good to it, Eric?
And what about the audience? Like teaching the audience how to...
Oh, that's a tough one. We talk high school. Start early. Get kids reading. There was always this newspapers and school stuff, and that was a scam. It truly was a scam. It was a way of building circulation. It was never done right. It was never done right. But I got into newspapers when I was young because of the sports section. So start young, just like reading books. Start young. And of course, it's going to be online, but get kids looking at something online. Get them to I hate to use it, but it is true. It's the brand. It's this newspaper means something other than, and then you fill in that blank. So we can. As a matter of fact, when we get to this panel, maybe we can talk more about that. But I'm not an expert, but there are ways of doing it, I think. And you are an expert, so you can tell us more about that.
Minecraft needs a newspaper.
Thank you. When I think about quality news or journalism, I think about who's telling the stories and what stories are they telling. And just in terms of racial and gender, not just equality, but equity, have you noticed with all the changes any better or for worse statistics or stories or trends for racial and gender equality and equity?
Yeah, there's, I'm reading a book. There have been over 4 decades now, roughly every 10 years, a survey of journalists to find out what's going on. And when it comes to equity in a newsroom representation, it's still terrible. Interestingly enough, it's better at the younger end. Now, the bad news is the newsrooms have gotten older because people are hanging on their job. So there's been some advancement. With gender, it's better in television than in newspapers. We did a study of gender, and we found this very interesting. So we looked at managers over 1947, 1977. So we wanted to know what happened with women in management in newspapers. And you can find that. It's an editor and publisher. And what we found is the absolute number increased over that 30 years, but the percentage was the same. And what happened is they added lifestyle sections and women's sections or whatever over that period of time. And that's where, so the women managers they hired were sort of put into the ghetto, put in, okay, that's for the little lady, you get over here and do that. And they weren't entering into main management. And that's still a problem. And there are people have been raising that issue. Part of the problem is, it's interesting because as bad as Gannett's been, Al Newharth, who ran Gannett, did a really good job creating diversity of gender in management in the newsroom. And it was very simple. If you're not promoting women, you don't get a raise. And that's literally what he did. So there are ways of doing that with ethnicity, race, gender, and all that, but it's not being done well in newspapers. It's better, really, to some degree, in television. Part of the problem is they've got such a mess now, they're just barely struggling to keep their heads above water when it comes to revenue. I think that will get better once we get better management and all of this sort of, we accept the fact that the print's going to roughly go away. It'll always, it'll be there. My daughter still has a vinyl collection, for God's sake. But it's going to be more of a niche thing. So I think the money will work its way out. It's never going back. It never does to where it was. And when that happens, maybe we'll do a better job of making sure that newsrooms and the content they produce. There was one study done as a master's, and so the students studied 10 newspapers in Michigan about news that was related specifically to women, gender, news about things that women were concerned about that men would be less so. And what she found is that it was more likely to be on the weekend editions because that's when women were in charge. Because the guys would work during the week and then they'd go home for the weekend and the women would be putting out the newspaper and you would find more content aimed at women. There's a long tradition of newspapers not supplying news for women. I mentioned that 1992 thing we did about cable, and there was an article about women, and they tended not to read newspapers compared to men. That's because men were doing it. They were producing it. Surprise, yeah. So I don't know if that answers it or not, but it continues to be an issue. I wish I had an answer. Yeah.
And that's our time. Thank you very much.
That was Ownership, Competition, and Quality Journalism. Where are we? How did we get here? What can we do? With Dr. Stephen Lacy. His talk was recorded on March 30th, 2019 at UAS in Juneau as part of the 2019 Juneau World Affairs Forum. Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World, produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council in partnership with the University of Alaska Southeast. With support from AEL&P, Coeur Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight & Associates, Sea Alaska, and Wastman & Associates.